Now my plan today is to talk about kids who have sustained injury and then have to make their way back to school. I'm going to include some information about different kinds of deficits they might experience, some ways that they might cope with them, and how their problems impact their lives and that of their families. I'm going to try to include as much as possible stories about kids that I've known, because that's the way I learn best, and I'm hoping that that will give you a really nice picture of what different kinds of deficits and other issues look like. I'm going to tell you I have a ton of information to share, and we're starting a little late. I talk kind of fast, but I'm really hoping that you can hold your questions until the end, and I'll try to get to them at that point. If you went to the presentation about pediatric brain injury this morning, you heard lots of concerning statistics about the incidence of traumatic brain injury in children. I'm not going to cover these again. But another statistic that I've learned says that about 1 child in every 25 has some history of brain injury. If you look at the class sizes we see these days, you're talking really about 1 kid in every classroom. So the idea that TBI is a rare issue is really false. All of the causes listed here result in traumatic brain injury because they're the result of external forces which affect the brain. You might also hear the term acquired brain injury. This is kind of a more global concept in some ways because it can encompass traumatic injuries, but it can also be used to apply to problems that occur to the, an issue that occurred to the child that's not traumatic. So they might be, they're not prenatal, but they do affect the brain. And these injuries might be internal issues like stroke or brain tumors or toxicity from chemicals, lack of oxygen to the brain, and other different kinds of conditions. Both types, whether it's traumatic or acquired, can result in cognitive and physical problems which can impact the individual over time. Research has suggested that for most people, recovery from brain injury progresses in approximately the same way, although each one's time schedule might be different. In general, we say the recovery is quickest in the first 6 to 12 months after the injury. After that, that recovery curve starts to flatten out and the individual eventually reaches a plateau. Even after this plateau occurs, though, the person can continue to demonstrate some improvements over a very long time, maybe even over the lifespan. Sometimes this is spontaneous recovery, but very often it results from the person's use of consistent compensatory strategies. Keep in mind, though, that it's possible for injured individuals, particularly those who are younger, to just maintain a very slow time schedule in their recovery. For example, we've seen kids at Weissman who were really mostly unresponsive for months and months and months. Then suddenly they started to kind of come back to themselves and start to do things. They had deficits and they still continued to progress pretty slowly, but they regained some skills. If an adult is still demonstrating deficits after approximately 2 years post-injury, these deficits are most likely permanent in nature, at least to some degree. Children display a similar type of recovery curve initially, but then have a different course over the longer term. For example, when I evaluate an older teen or an adult shortly after an injury, and then see them again about a year later, I do usually see significant improvements in many areas. When I have the chance to do a couple of assessments over a number of years, those changes become less and less dramatic until the point where there's pretty little variation from assessment to assessment. When I see children, the evaluation results typically follow that same pattern at the very beginning, with rapid recovery early and then a gradual plateau. But the length of time is typically dependent on how old the child is at the time of injury. When that injury occurs very early in life, also very common for the parent to report that the child begins to experience more problems as they get older, and some of the test scores that I get when I test them start to decline. Very possible for deficits that are displayed very early in a child's life after an injury to persist over time. There is also a significant possibility, though, that new problems will emerge, just as I said. For example, when kids are very young and they're injured, by the time they enter school, people have begun to forget that they were injured. Particularly if they were told by medical people, et cetera, that the kid was going to be fine, and they become used to the child's behavior. Okay. If there's an issue, that kid is often misidentified as having some other problem, like a learning disability or ADHD. Also, higher order deficits don't appear for quite a while. Higher level brain functions just take time to develop. They might not be operational at the time when the child is injured, but then don't appear at the right time. Environmental changes also change a lot, or environmental demands also change a lot over time. For example, young kids are not expected to display much in the way of executive functioning. My favorite story about this, and if somebody's heard it from me already, just ignore me because I tell the same stories a lot because they're so good. I have a friend who has a 4-year-old, and she took him to the voting line where they had to wait a really long time, and he's wandering around the room, and finally he ends up flat on the floor beneath her and says in a really loud voice, "Mom, are you wearing any underwear?" So we didn't expect him to have much executive function because he's 4, okay? An injury to the frontal lobes of the brain can result in executive problems in a greater way when that child reaches middle or high school. I saw one kid when he was 4, he was doing great. By the time he got to 8th grade, though, he had so, much problems with organization and other kinds of skills. It was really, really, really interfering with his ability to succeed in that environment. All right, now this is a graph of children's normal development. What we expect is that each child will acquire skills at particular ages, and they're going to refine and then add skills over time. And the developmental curve just goes up in a really nice way. Okay. At the time of an injury, that child who otherwise was doing well suddenly suffers a dramatic loss of capabilities. What I often describe to my parents is that their child will, their injured brain goes back to a much more primitive level of functioning, and it then needs to try to reacquire the skills that it lost. So what you see in the graph is there's this sudden and dramatic drop, and then followed by a sometimes equally dramatic return in function, at least early on, but then it levels off. What happens over a longer time, though, is that injured child struggles to refine skills and to add new ones at the same rate or to the extent that their friends do. Okay? Over time, that gap between him and the rest of the other kids tends to widen and widen. Some of the issues that we see after an injury can be reduced or even eliminated with appropriate rehabilitation and with academic support and other interventions. We have to remain aware, though, that the degree of recovery that each child makes is dependent on a very large number of factors. We're going to talk about some of them later. Many children can't go back to their previous level of functioning, whether in specific areas or in a lot of them, and they need ongoing support for a very long time. Further, many children may not have the access to rehabilitation and other supports that they need in order to achieve their maximum possible recovery. A major focus in adult TBI rehabilitation is return to work. It's a big deal. While some adults can return to their previous jobs, maybe not at the same level, or maybe they can, rehabilitation efforts can also be directed towards helping them identify and then train for other career paths. And they might do volunteer, or they might select some other kind of option. Children, though, don't have that choice. School is their work. They don't have another choice to do. They don't have real alternatives with the exception of selecting a specific kind of program that might be more special. So pediatric rehabilitation needs to focus on return to school. Very important when that is ready to occur for there to be very good communication between the rehab facility staff, the parents, and the school system. Okay? This requires a number of different kinds of assessments. At Weissman, the social worker first starts to work with the family about return to school pretty much right at the time of admission. It starts very early on. Okay? Then the communication is ongoing throughout the child's hospitalization, so at the time of discharge, everybody's ready for the next step. Okay? For example, some kids get homebound instruction for some time. Other kids can go back to school, at least on a part-time basis, and then maybe slowly transition to full-time. The rehab team also takes care to develop a list of strategies which can be used by teachers, whether in the home or at school, and that'll help that child compensate for the deficits that he has. Okay, when you're talking about doing those assessments, the goal is to get the most detailed picture of that child's strengths and weaknesses at that moment that you can. Okay. Okay, the evaluation needs to cover a lot of different aspects. One segment is a neuropsychological evaluation. It's completed by somebody like me. That provides a very detailed picture of that child's capabilities. Now, I'm also a school psychologist, and I used to work in schools. And I'll tell you that what neuropsychologists do is what school psychologists do times 10 in terms of depth and complexity. Okay. I can, as a school psychologist, also try to translate all that neuropsychological data into something that can be used for a school recommendation. So it's not just here's the numbers, here's what's good and what's bad, but what do you do about it? Okay. Another segment is the child study team evaluation. Now this does require some coordination with the neuropsychologist because there can be some overlap. For example, I could do the academic assessment or someone on the child study team can do that. In school, though, it's easy for them to do other kinds of assessments like psychological or behavioral screenings. Keep in mind that kids, particularly those with less severe injuries, may not lose skills that they've previously acquired. Where they have difficulty is gaining new ones. Another part of the evaluation needs to be looking at the social and behavioral aspects of school. That might require a functional classroom observation. But school obviously is a much less structured situation than my little testing room. I know there's a lot more going on, there's a lot more distractions, and the pace is very different. I can pace for an individual child. In the school, that instruction goes on whether or not that injured child can keep up. Okay. You'll also want to see how they maybe can do the work or retrieve information under performance conditions, which is really what a school environment is. I had the occasion once to talk to a supervisor in a local school district about my doing a presentation for them. And we were talking about different things that I could talk about, and I suggested brain injury. And the supervisor said, well, I'm not really interested because we don't have any of those kids here. So what did I say about those statistics? 1 kid in every 25. So clearly, it seemed, that there probably were kids there who they didn't know about. It also highlights how likely a child, particularly with a mild brain injury, might not be recognized in a school setting. Okay. And also, the conversation also highlights just how the majority of us, and I include my former school psychologist self, really don't know anything about kids with brain injuries. It's not covered in our training programs. We don't run into them, as far as we know, that often. So when we try to prepare kids for return to school, we also try to prepare teachers for having that child return to them. Usually we recommend that there be some in-service training of the staff, and that includes not just the teachers, but everybody who's going to encounter that child, from the teacher to the aide, to the cafeteria people, to the people supervising on the playground. All of those people need to be apprised of what's going on with that kid. It may also be important for the other kids to get some information about how that child is likely to function in the classroom, and for the child himself to get reoriented to going to school. Ongoing communication between school and family will not only help that kid's transition back to school, but also with his progress over time. Okay? So for example, information about the child's fatigue level or their struggle with particular assignments can then be used to plan modifications in the program or in particular kinds of tasks. Children who are recovering from brain injury are eligible for special educational classification and programming with an IEP. They may also need more frequent than the typical yearly modifications of that IEP because they're changing very rapidly, particularly at the beginning. Okay, now we're going to talk about some specific cognitive issues. Okay. One of the major issues that we see after children have sustained brain injuries is difficulties with attention and information processing. And attention itself is a construct that has a lot of different facets. Might just be how much information can that child take in at one bite. If their capacity is limited, they're going to miss little bits of information, kind of like a flickered light. They think they were listening, but they missed something. Okay? Then they make mistakes, and people think, oh, they're not listening, they're just careless. And that kind of problem can also be confused with another common issue known as mother deafness. You know, like you tell your child, go upstairs and get my red sweater. And the child comes back either with another kind of sweater or something red or maybe nothing at all. And everyone's, oh, I'm not listening. You know, I didn't get that right note in my voice. But really what happened was that brain got full and just blinked out for a second. Sustained attention problems creates a situation where that child just zones out. Okay? They lose time. Suddenly it's 20 minutes later and they don't know what they were even thinking about. That looks like daydreaming to a teacher, or it looks like lack of motivation. Okay? So, because they can't complete tasks in a timely way. Okay? With kids have increased distractibility, then what happens is they can't screen out even the little minor things that happen in a classroom. They might lose track in the middle of an activity. I've even had kids lose track in the middle of a sentence. They start something and suddenly look at me like, what was I talking about? Because suddenly their brain shifted somewhere else. Issues with working memory, that's really your brain's ability to hold and do things with the stuff there. Kind of your little mental scratch pad. Means that the child might have some trouble keeping more than one thing at once in their mind. My daughter has ADHD, and she said to me one time, Mom, don't you realize that everything you say disappears as soon as it leaves your mouth? She just can't hold all that information in one scratch pad at a time. Okay? So maybe that child can't follow a two-step direction like get out your math book and turn to page 22, let alone do problems X to X. Often the child might not have poor attention, but they just process information much more slowly. So they have trouble keeping up with conversations. And then what happens in a lecture class when the teacher's just going on and on and on, and they're just not keeping up. I actually had the experience where I was reading some of the memory stories to a kid, and then I have her say them back to me. Well, she got the first sentence of each story. When I asked her the questions that were designed to help her recognize the information as it went by, she didn't know any of the answers. The only thing she was able to process and hold was that first sentence. Cognitive fatigue is something that's particular to brain injury. That's a brain's inability to deal with very large bits of information over a long period of time. It just gets exhausted. Doing very minimal work oftentimes. If any of you have ever sat outside an intensive care unit or a surgical suite with a sick family member, you know you sat there all day, all you did was walk to the coffee machine and back, and weren't you exhausted at the end of that time? That's emotional fatigue of the brain. You weren't doing anything physical, but you were emotionally exhausted. Cognitive is like that, but it's the brain's reaction to large amounts of thinking. Cognitive deficits become exaggerated when the person is very fatigued. And that can get better over time, but can also continue, at least to some extent. I tested a kid a long time ago now, the kid's like 30. He was 14 at the time, and when I was first introduced to him, he was sleeping 21 hours a day. He could only be up for half an hour at the time, and then he went back to sleep. Even now, he's graduated from college, from a very prestigious golf course management company, course at Penn State. He has a job with Titleist out in California. He still has to work a split shift, where he works in the morning, has to go home and take a nap, and then he goes back to work in the late afternoon and early evening because his fatigue is still bothering him. When we talk about compensating for these issues in school, we talk about things like repeating directions or providing them in written form. We lots of times, if we can, get kids to use technology. They all love technology. So they can have a smart pen that they could be doing stick figure dinosaurs, but it will be recording what's happening in the classroom, and then they can go back and touch that dinosaur and it will replay what the teacher was saying at the time, and they don't miss anything. They can replay it as much as they want. These are kids who might need extended time to do activities because they get so distracted, or they might need breaks where they just have to stop and regroup. They might need both of those things. We don't really realize how much we depend on memory on a day-to-day basis. When we wake up in the morning, in a split second, we go through this whole memory routine. Where are we? What time is it? What day is it? Do I have to go to work today? You know, what's the weather out? We do this, we reorient ourselves every minute. That's why when we wake up in a strange hotel room, it's weird. Like your routine can't work the way it's supposed to. Right? There's a lot of different kinds of memory, and a child may have difficulty with just one, or several, or lots. Most people know about verbal or semantic memory. That's memory for facts, for stories, for conversations, those kinds of things that are more verbal. We also have visual memory though. Memory for pictures, for graphs, for places. I haven't driven here in several years, and yet a lot of the route was familiar to me because I have a visual representation of it. There's something called episodic memory, which is memory for events. It can be a general class of event, like every birthday party I've ever gone to, or it could be just my daughter's 5-year-old birthday party. Right? Procedural memory is another kind. That's memory for activities that we do so much we don't even really think about them. Walking is kind of procedural memory. Driving, typing, any of those, playing the piano, all of those call for procedural memory. At some point after injury, the child can often recall at least most of the information that he or she learned before that time. They can lose some memories prior to the injury. It might be a shorter period, it might be a longer period. And some of that is because they just haven't placed it in long-term storage yet. Sometimes they just lose the ability to access memories that they have, and that might be for a shorter or a longer time. More often, kids have trouble acquiring new memories. So that's remembering names or dates or assignments or gym clothes in school. And that can present a safety issue at times, like if they're having trouble remembering that they have something on the stove at home or remembering to lock their door. But it also interrupts other kinds of things, including social interactions. I knew a boy once who had a terrible memory problem. He goes back to school, he can't remember his locker combination. Every day he's at the office getting the locker combination, which is embarrassing. You know, the other kids are something like, what's wrong with that? Then they decided, okay, we'll put it inside his trapper keeper. And then he didn't remember that it was there. So he still is at the office, and they say, look, in your trapper keeper. So it was really an interference to his ability to function. When we talk about compensating for memory problems, there's lots of devices and tools out there. And it doesn't matter to me personally whether someone has a good memory or they just have a good tool to use. Because one can work as well as the other. Okay? The issue with kids is that they need to understand that they need to use the tool. And this is a particular problem with teens who, I always say, teens want to be totally unique while being like everybody else simultaneously. So the idea that they might have to use something is really a problem for them a lot of the time. I never had to use one before, so why do I have to do it now? So they fight you. Kids, I said, do tend to be open to using different kinds of technology, like using their phone for reminders, or getting alerts, or using an electronic calendar, or using the smart pen. They still have to be prompted to use them because they might forget what they're there for or why they put the alert in their phone. And it's a bigger problem when those forgetful kids lose that expensive equipment. I have a kid who's now on her 5th cell phone. And they aren't cheap, especially the ones that have a lot of bells and whistles to them. Less high-tech strategies include things like checklists and paper calendars and taking notes. These have to be geared towards the individual child because they can become very overwhelming if they're not a good fit. You see the kids with the trapper keepers that don't close beyond this, because there's so much stuff just jammed in them. Okay? Kids with memory deficits can learn routines like procedural memories, but they're going to need some repetition, maybe a lot of repetition in order to do that. In severe cases of communication impairment, the child has global aphasia. That's really an inability to verbalize thoughts or understand what they hear or try to read. Even milder forms of aphasia, though, can still present significant problems when that kid tries to return to normal activities. So if they have difficulty with word finding, they might respond to an oral math problem with the wrong number. They want to say 2 and they say 6. Right? So it looks like a mistake. They might be able to express simple ideas or answer really basic questions, but not the more complicated ones. I see that when I try to give the comprehension subtest of the WISC, the intelligence test. They might be able to provide the one-word answers or mostly one words they need to do analogies, but they can't describe a solution. Some kids add tangential information. So they're wandering from topic to topic, and you're like, where do where did we going with this? Or they omit things, so you really can't tell what's going on. So you have to end up asking lots and lots of questions to kind of figure out the thread of what they're talking about. Problems, with verbal expression, particular higher order verbal expression, affects both thinking or speaking and writing. So then academically, there's an issue when that child needs to do a written assignment. Okay. And then when kids have a lot of trouble expressing themselves, they start to withdraw socially. Especially as kids get older, the interaction is much more verbal in nature. If someone has receptive problems, they have difficulty remembering the meaning of words. I had a very educated lady one time get a question on the adult IQ test. That's why is it important to study history? And she looked at me. This is a lady with a college degree who said, "What's history?" So even very basic vocabulary can suddenly sound like, Chinese. They could have difficulty keeping up with large amounts of information, like multiple conversations at once. Kind of like I always say to parents, it's kind of like going to France and you only speak high school French. You can get some of it, but a lot of it is just washing on by you. They might use a strategy to compensate what I call keyword listening. They respond to the one or a couple words in what you said that makes sense to them. It may not be the most relevant thing to what you're saying, so they sound like really off the mark. I actually got referred a kid that people at school thought he was psychotic because they would say something and he would answer like over here or somewhere. They thought, oh, this is flight of ideas or something. Turns out he'd had Lyme disease that impacted his brain and really seriously damaged his language skills. So he was focusing on some very tiny words and trying to do what they wanted, and he was really, really, really off the mark. When kids are in conversation and they have language difficulties, it might be very subtle. So they might just have trouble like understanding nuances or metaphors. Very indirect speech. One of my favorite things is the teacher who says to a kid, the kid's playing with something, a race or something, "I don't want to see you playing with that." So then the kid goes under the desk. Teacher says, fresh, oppositional. What she said, though, is, "I don't want to see you playing with it." She didn't see him, but that's not what she meant. But it is what she said. So that can be an issue. To compensate for language problems, we have to give kids extended time maybe to verbalize. We might have to ask a lot more questions. We might have to review that kid's response to see where the misunderstanding came. When kids have trouble with problem solving, they might have trouble understanding what the problem is or remembering how to solve that problem that they had in the past, like kind of a brain freeze thing. Okay? They might interpret things very concretely, so they're only focusing on a tiny detail and they totally miss the big picture. They might have trouble with as if, like hypothetical thinking. One of the things we always ask to try to assess a child's safety is, like, what would you do if you went to a party and people were drinking? Like, make a good choice here. And the kid says, well, I just wouldn't go there. Well, okay, you wouldn't make that conscious choice. However, what happens if a lot of kids are drinking or smoking or something at a party? Well, I just wouldn't go there. They get fixated on something. Good problem solving requires flexibility. We all make plans every day and then we need to change them. Okay? My daughter, when she was about in second grade, was in a play and I had made her this great monkey costume, all furry and a tail with a big long coat, coat hanger covered with fur in it. She had one line. She was supposed to jump out and give the line. And what happened was she jumps out and her tail gets caught. So first, she decides, okay, I'll step back. I'll jump out again. No, didn't solve the problem. She turns, she yanks on the tail. Finally, she says, hey, somebody come help me with this tail. She was 7, For a 7-year-old, that's an incredible amount of flexibility and problem solving, and something she probably never repeated again, but she did it. If a child has a brain injury, they might not even be able to do that second step. Okay. So what we try to do is maybe give them some options. What might happen? Let's think about what you could do in a situation. We might use a formal strategy. We might rehearse something. So whatever the response we want is the well-worn path. Executive problems also include things like which includes problem solving and flexibility, are all related to frontal lobes of the brain. They tell you what to do, when to do it, how to do it, when to start, when to stop. It's your abstract thinking, your reasoning, your personality regulation, and all that stuff. Very difficult to assess except through observation. Also very difficult to remediate in any kind of really direct way. Poor awareness of deficit is something we see frequently after an injury. That is, the person has a lot of difficulty recognizing changes in their skills even when they're directly confronted with them. This lack of awareness can be partial or it can be total, and it's often confused with emotional denial. Like, we think of denial as really convincing yourself that the deficit doesn't happen because having a deficit is like too painful to think about. The person who has an injury-related limitation in awareness just can't see those weaknesses no matter what. Okay? They sometimes can be convinced that other people see problems that they don't see, but it takes a long time. Okay? Awareness can improve over time, but kids or adults who have poor insight tend to be pretty difficult to engage in treatment. They don't understand why we're bothering them. They just don't. They think they're fine. So kids who have problems with self-awareness also can have trouble with goal setting. They can't see where they are versus where they need to be. And even if they see where they are, they can't stay on the path to get to where they want to be. Problems with initiation make kids have trouble starting things. On the flip side, they might have trouble stopping things. So they're doing the same kind of behavior over and over again, even though it's not really working for them. So I have a kid who can't write. He can't start to write because he feels like he needs to produce the perfect thing and he can't get going with it. Okay? So these are kids who can't do their homework, can't get their homework done, or they don't complete chores. And in people's eyes, they look lazy or they look unmotivated. Okay? Let me tell you, what is the major thing that happens when a kid returns to school after a mild head injury, like a concussion, and they have problems with like light sensitivity and sound sensitivity, and they have cognitive fatigue, and they're sitting in class, and they have, if they're forced to take the sunglasses off, and they have the headphones in their ears, and they're just sitting there like that. What is the number one referral that happens? Drug counselor. They don't think head injury. But these are kids who have trouble with all kinds of processing, and they might have trouble with initiation to say, hey, I had an injury and now I'm different. Other kids might need to have a very high level of arousal, like a prod of some kind, whether it's anxiety or something physical, to get them to start things. When kids have organizational problems, they can be really obvious. That's the book bag that's in archaeological layers by century, even though the kid's like 8. You know, you go sifting through all the stuff. Or it can be pretty subtle. So these are kids who write papers, but they're full of boilerplate, or they're just wandering around and never get actually to the topic. Previously easy tasks are now harder because they can't put them in the right order. They start in the middle and then need to backtrack. They have to do a project. It takes 10 trips to Staples to get everything that they need. In the meantime, everybody around them is going nuts. Okay. They might have trouble reading, understanding what they read, not because they can't understand the words, but they can't integrate the information, something that particularly happens as kids get older. And then problems with time awareness, which is another executive skill. They can't estimate how long it might take to do things. They don't feel time passing. They're always late. They can't complete things in a timely way. To compensate for these, these are kids that need a lot of environmental support and structure, not something that can come internally. They need prompts. They need procedure sheets. We need to go over what they need to do ahead of time so that they know what they're doing. And these strategies have to be customized for the individual child, so they need to be experimented first until you find exactly the right thing. ADHD is actually a form of executive dysfunction. So looking for strategies to compensate, you might look to that literature. Preschool and elementary students present with all kinds of behavioral symptoms. They're hyperactive, they're distracted, they're impulsive, they have trouble with attention, they have a lot of emotional and behavioral regulations like tantrums, and they might be aggressive, that keep on going beyond the age when that's developmentally appropriate. Older kids can certainly have the same symptoms, but they're more of a problem for them because the range of acceptable behaviors now has gotten a lot narrower. Difficulties with things like disinhibition, which is not being able to kind of keep from blurting out or doing things inappropriately, or other problems with self-regulation start to separate those kids from the other kids their age. It also places them at more risk for problems like substance abuse or sexual acting out, as well as poor academic performance. What we try to do for those kids is try to monitor that behavior to identify specific problems or situations that trigger a negative response. It might be the time of day or the type of task or even the people that they're with. We try to review the problem situations with the child, not when it's happening, but in kind of a more neutral time, and then provide some direct teaching of ways maybe that they could practice to avoid it. We want to monitor that child's behavior for signs of stress or overload so we can kind of take them out of a problem situation before they have an outburst. In the classroom, teachers need to kind of do this monitoring, but avoid being confrontational with the child, particularly if there's a teen. And if the problem happens, you need to deal with it immediately. Many of these kids have mood of the minute. So if you don't deal with it immediately, only get to it later, then only remember why they did what they did or what happened, and you're kind of saying, well, like, why are you bothering me again? Brain injury survivors, whether child or adult, frequently display problems with emotional regulation. So their mood might shift from 0 to 160 in like 10 seconds. Okay? And they might have outbursts with very minimal provocation. So while teasing from a sibling might not have bothered them in the past, suddenly it's a major deal for them. While the percentage of young children who become depressed after brain injury is relatively low, this can be severe when it occurs. A lot of times, particularly in teens, it's related to their awareness of the changes in themselves and the loss of sense of self or loss of self-esteem that goes with it. Anxiety disorders are most commonly present as persistent and excessive worries. These may or may not be realistic, like reality-based. So for example, I knew one girl who had a realistic fear of going upstairs because she was afraid that she would have a seizure and not be found. Okay, that was pretty realistic. Okay. Another child I know, though, was terrified of opening car windows because she felt that she would fly out. Not so realistic, and yet a very debilitating fear for her. Younger children with brain injuries may have a lot of separation anxiety, like they don't want to leave home. That might be that child's response to hospitalization, where they were without their parents maybe for a prolonged period of time. Or it might be a teen's fear of kind of losing it when they don't want to lose it. Okay? So my guy who had the severe cognitive fatigue, when it came time for him to go to senior week, several years after his injury, he didn't want to go, even though his parents tried as much as possible to build in a lot of supports for him. He was really afraid that he was not going to be able to resist the peer pressure for like alcohol use and maybe some sexual activity that he thought were going to be pretty prevalent in that environment. About 2/3 of individuals demonstrate some kind of change in their personality after a brain injury. Can be minor or major, might be temporary or permanent. The most commonly reported personality symptom is increased irritability. Also at the top of this list, though, are things like poor tolerance for frustration. Things bother them way more than they used to. Impatience, difficulties with transitions, difficulty taking alternate perspectives, so they can't see what we see. Some child TBI survivors may also display blunted affect. They have flat facial expressions. They have flat voice tone. In some cases, this blunting can also be accompanied by restricted range of emotional feelings inside the person. So these are kids who appear very flat on the outside and also feel kind of flat on the inside. Okay? Both of those groups tend to be referred for at least a depression evaluation, even though if you ask them, they don't feel particularly depressed, but they look depressed to us. Children with injuries to the frontal lobes frequently demonstrate a new onset of problems interpreting social language, body language, voice tone. I used to work for somebody who was extremely volatile. We shared an office. Every morning I would literally go in and, as I said, put the toe in and sniff the air and decide if I needed to go in or not. Like, was he in a good mood? He wasn't even looking at me, not even facing me, but somehow I got the message that I probably shouldn't go in some days. If you can't do that, you tend to misinterpret what's going on. Okay? So these are kids who might have poor judgment and poor impulse control, so they make really not so good choices. I have one guy, his mom called me a couple weeks ago and said, Rob is telling a lot of very sexually explicit and inappropriate jokes in a lot of situations, not just with his teenage friends, but in other settings. First of all, he didn't even know they were inappropriate. Second of all, he didn't even get them. Somebody laughed, he said, okay, that's funny, I should just keep on saying that. But he wasn't really understanding how his behavior didn't fit. They might be behaving in a more immature way, for their age. Then their behavior leads to a lot of negative feedback from their peers, maybe loss of friends, and then they end up being socially isolated. Poor judgment can go another way. It might lead a kid to risk-taking, to oppositional behavior, or choosing inappropriate friends. I knew a girl who had been like the pillar of the community before her injury, and afterwards was just so disinhibited and so misperceiving of social things. She ended up losing all her friends. She ended up taking up with this very goth kind of group who was engaging in all kinds of very inappropriate behaviors. It was worrying her parents to death, but she felt like they were the only friends she could have. These kids are much more vulnerable to drug and alcohol use. First, they don't even understand the risks of that to themselves. And secondly, they think it makes them more attractive to other kids. And thirdly, ingesting those substances can reduce depression and other kinds of emotional problems that they're having. So that they become pulled towards that because they feel better. These kids want relationships, but they struggle to find a peer group. When kids who have sustained injuries return to school, they have a number of supports available to them in that setting, as I said before. First steps is identifying their strengths and weaknesses, get an IEP, and then put in the IEP all the kind of modifications and adjunct services and things that they need at the time. And again, they need to be reassessed relatively frequently because they're going to be changing as they're recovering. There are a number of levels of instruction available for kids with brain injury, ranging from regular education classes, with or without supports, inclusion classes, which may offer a slower pace and more opportunities for practice and repetition, and more adult assistance. They might get resource room placement for specific subjects. And then there are self-contained classes for kids who can't really make it in a regular environment. Within all of those settings, though, other supports are also available. For example, some kids need one-to-one assistance with specific things, where other kids maybe can do something in a small group. Okay? In addition, teachers need to be really aware of what's going on with these kids. Outside the classroom, that kid can get adjunct services like OT and PT and speech. They might have a consultation with a technology specialist. They might get counseling, sometimes in school, sometimes on a private basis though, depending on the extent. They might get social skills instruction. Okay, and if they have a lot of behavioral difficulties, these probably need to be addressed with behavior planning with assistance from a professional behavior support person. The greatest stressor faced by parents relates to the management of those changes in their child's emotional and behavioral presentation. Those daily accumulations of minor stresses and then the big ones affect that parent-child relationship and also affects the parent's ability to cope effectively on a day-to-day basis. Research has shown that there has a big chance of increased family dysfunction after a significant pediatric brain injury, related to family strain, just kind of managing all the different facets of the injury. It might be because parents are depressed. It might be because they become socially isolated because they have so much on their plate. And then also there's a loss of income. Maybe one parent has to quit work in order to care for their injured child. After the injury occurs, everybody in that family becomes engaged in a grief or loss process. They, may be very happy that they still have their child, but now they have to mourn the loss of the child that they had in order to get used to the child that they now have, who might be very different. Some parents get stuck at that denial stage. Now, denial can be protective, particularly early on, but if people get stuck there, it can be a problem because it keeps the family from moving on, and they might make, choices that maybe aren't the best ones for their child. Professionals often feel this need to try to break through that denial, but you have to let families work through it at their own pace as much as possible, particularly at the beginning. Because you don't want to alienate them, because then you have no chance to help them in the future. Interventions in pediatric brain injury should always include the family. Has to include the family, because changes in one member inevitably affects the other ones. Okay, everybody in that family has to adapt to new roles. They might have to take on new responsibilities, just as the injured child does. Okay, and a generally supportive environment can protect that whole family and support that whole family. Okay, so that in terms of when parents interact with each other, need to be as much on the same page as possible. If they polarize, then that's going to impact everybody. There can be a big risk of family fracture. Education about brain injury and its effects should be initiated as soon as possible. That starts in the hospital. Teaching may still be needed at intervals, sometimes very frequent intervals over time, particularly as the family members adjust and they start asking more questions. Later, they're going to need instruction in specific skills like managing behavior or teaching memory or other compensatory strategies. In general, though, those family needs need to be very carefully assessed, because when you plan, you have to match not only the developmental level of the child, the child's issues, but also the family resources and the family strengths, and as well as their perception of what's going on, because without that, you're not going to have any successful interventions. They just won't be able to follow through. All right, well, that was talking really at breakneck speed. I'm going to, have you ask questions as you want. I will also say, if any of you are planning on staying for my next presentation in a couple of minutes, I will tell you that there is some overlap, particularly when I talk about brain injury and some of the other things. So if you want to sit through some of that again in order to hear the new stuff, that's great. Otherwise, I certainly understand. So, all right, anybody have any questions?